Hello students, and welcome to Ethical and Legal Issues in Healthcare. Today we'll be talking about designer babies. Designer babies. Okay, I'll ask you to, at this point, think about what you actually understand by the term designer babies, what it actually means to you, and then we'll look at the formal definition. So often we actually think of characteristics or traits that are desirable. You know, what in fact it's considered to be the top echelon of the human race. What is a designer baby? Well, in terms of the formal definition, it's a baby whose genetic makeup has been selected in order to eradicate a particular defect or to ensure that a particular gene is present. Now, that's actually quite interesting when you look at it, because it's not about favourable characteristics, it's about the eradication of negative characteristics. So at present, the technology that's available is not used to design a baby by selecting specific characteristics that the child will have, but rather it allows parents to actually choose between available embryos based on the genetic profile of each embryo. And that process is actually called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. But the technology is certainly rapidly evolving, and it's not far off. In fact, I think there are some parts in Europe and in fact America where pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is used in the alternate to actually implant positive characteristics and to ensure that positive characteristics are actually in the bloodline of parents. So what is PGD? Well, PGD, it's a form of assisted reproduction. So it's essentially the same as IVF, if you like, but with a few extra steps. And those steps are, well, initially, the female undergoes fertility treatment to hyper-stimulate the production of eggs. These eggs are then collected and are fertilised. Each fertilised egg is allowed to undergo mitosis until about the 6 or 8 cell stage. One cell is then removed from each embryo and undertaken genetic evaluation. So that's the step that's specific when we're actually talking about designer babies. And embryos found to carry the defective genes are then discarded. Now, of the remaining embryos, some are then reimplanted into the female, and the remaining embryos are often frozen for future use. So it's the step of the testing and the discarding of unfavourable embryos that we're actually talking about today. So I guess I'd ask you to consider what your opinion is with respect to genetic testing and diseases using PGD, and what you would do in those circumstances. So if you had the gene or you knew somebody that had the gene, would you undergo embryonic screening? You know, put yourself in the position with somebody who actually has a genetic disorder and you're contemplating having a child. What, from your perspective, makes it ethical or unethical? Now, again, depending upon how you actually analyse the issue based on principles, whether it be autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence or justice, your perspective might differ significantly. Now, by now, I know that you all are quite familiar with these principles of ethics, autonomy being you know, the right of the individual to choose. And it could be argued that based on autonomy, you know, supporting screening and opposing screening is preserved, that really it's up to the individual to decide in those circumstances what they actually consider to be right or wrong for themselves. Again, beneficence doing good or non-maleficence doing harm, it really does depend upon which stakeholder that you're actually examining the issue from. Is it from the issue of the parents? Is it the issue of is it from the position of the parents? Is it from the position of the unborn child, of the embryo, and what harm, what constitutes the harm. Is there relative harm, being born with a disability as opposed to not being born at all, and the right to life? And also justice. So what's actually considered to be fair, what's considered to be equitable, who has access to this technology, and who is excluded from it. Again, if you actually look at consequentialism, right or wrong, based on the consequences of the action, well, are you looking at it from a society level? Are you looking at it from a family perspective? Are you looking at it from an individual perspective? And again, you can actually work through the analysis as to what you actually consider in terms of whether it's ethical or not. The rightness or the wrongness based on the underlying motive. Is it about self-interest from the parents? You know, this idea that you're actually choosing embryos without disability, or is that for the quality of life of the child, or is it because the parents don't feel that they can actually cope with supporting for and caring for a child with special needs? So again, you can actually see, depending upon whose perspective you actually analyse the issue from, even the theories themselves won't actually be conclusive in telling you how to actually approach this particular subject matter. So that's in terms of the ethics. Let's talk about it in terms of the legislation. Now, in Australia, we don't actually have any Commonwealth legislation regarding assisted reproductive technology. The New South Wales specific legislation that we talk about is the Assisted Reproductive Technology Act of 2007 and the Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation of 2009. And that's specifically what I'd like to talk to you about today. So a lot of this particular area of law is also governed by guidelines, and the NHMRC is the body that has sought to regulate with controls, checks and balances around the use of technology in this area. So there are national guidelines for the ethical use of assisted reproductive technology, and it covers activities such as gender selection and PGD. So it stipulates that facilities must be accredited to obtain a license to practice assisted reproductive technology. And specifically what it actually says, if we move on to the next slide, is that PGD can be used to detect serious genetic conditions. It can, in rare instances, be used to select an embryo that is compatible tissue match for a sibling. So this whole idea of, say, your siblings. So under specific circumstances, that is in fact permissible. Clients must give informed consent. There has to be pre and post test counselling. Clinics are required to give current, objective and accurate information to go into an ability to consent. Remember, one of the guidelines or one of the provisions to be able to consent is having all the information free of duress, free of manipulation, with the ability to consider, reflect and cool off if you actually change your mind. Now, in Australia, PGD, like I said, can be used to detect serious genetic conditions, to improve outcomes for, in some instances, some strict instances, compatible tissue match for a sibling. It can't be used to prevent conditions that do not seriously harm the person to be born. It can't be used to select the gender of an embryo other than to avoid a disease linked to a gender. So you can pick the gender so long as the reason for picking it is to actually eradicate or to prevent a disease, but not for the idea of family balancing, not because you want a girl or you want a boy. So you can you can't also, select in favour of a genetic defect or disability. Now, that's quite interesting because in the States you can. And there's been some interesting case law of a homosexual couple who actually selected to have a hearing impaired child, a deaf child, on the basis that in fact both the parents, both the women involved, were actually hearing impaired themselves. And in their mind, their argument was that they belonged to a deaf community with a very strong culture, and their child would be alienated and isolated if in fact they weren't hearing impaired. So I'll let you to think about, leave you to think about what you think of that and whether we've got the right balance here in Australia. So other regulation that you need to be mindful of is the Medical Practice Act of 1994, the Health Services Act of 1988, the Health Services Conciliation and Review Act of 1987, and the Code of Ethics of the Australian Medical Association. So medical practitioners providing assisted reproductive technology services are also subject to general medical regulation under this legislation. And they also must comply with their own particular code of ethics. So as I said, in Australia, we don't actually allow family balancing and based on, you know, picking a particular gender so that the family members can be balanced. And I'll ask you just to sort of consider what you think with respect to that from an ethical perspective. Is that in fact drawing the line too closely, or is that pretty much getting it right? So just in terms of a frame of reference, what is the position overseas? So as you can see from this map here, many countries have banned sex selection of embryos except for hereditary gender-related disorders. But perhaps parents want to select the sex of their child. Should they be allowed to, in order, you know, for their family to be complete? Whereas other people sort of say, well, as long as it's a healthy baby, it doesn't matter what gender. So there'll be some more interesting discussion, no doubt, in the tutorials around this topic. And thank you for listening. Thank you.